How can the structure of Daniel 2 lead us to the main point of this chapter and give us hope and comfort in difficult and uncertain times like these? Let's take a look. Hi, welcome to another episode of Masterpiece. My name is Chris, and I'm fascinated by this book. Not just because there's so many amazing things to discover once you take a closer look, but also because the deeper you go, the more you realize how extremely relevant this book is for our own lives. So, if you've been following this channel, you know that we're in the book of Daniel right now. So far, we've looked at the very last verse of Daniel chapter 1, and then we looked at the very first verse of that chapter. By the way, if you missed those videos, check them out right up here in the info box. So we've looked at the outer two verses of chapter 1, and of course there's plenty more stuff to discover in this chapter. And really, that's an understatement. I mean, we could study this chapter for the rest of our lives and not be done with it. And maybe we'll go back to chapter 1 sometime, but this time I want to talk about chapter 2, more specifically about the structure of chapter 2. Now, I already shared in a previous video that structures play a pretty important role in the Bible, that there are different kinds of structures, chiastic structures, parallel panel structures, and that if you want to find a structure, it's always helpful to look for repeated words and phrases, and then to check if there are any patterns. Now, in this particular case, that approach is not so easy, simply because Daniel 2 is a rather long chapter. It has 49 verses, which means you're going to be marking repetitions for quite some time. So here's a little shortcut for longer narratives like Daniel 2. Try to determine the different scenes of the narrative first. For example, by noting character and or location shifts. In other words, try to note where new or different characters or locations are introduced, because those are often the places where one scene ends and another one begins. If we analyze Daniel 2 that way, we discover that there are basically 5 main scenes in that chapter. The chapter begins with a scene with Nebuchadnezzar and the wise men. Then there's a scene with Daniel and Arioch, and then Daniel goes into the king. There's a scene with Daniel and his friends where they pray. Then there's another scene with Daniel and Arioch, and Daniel goes into the king. And finally, there's a scene with Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. You probably already noticed it, right? Scene 1 seems to be parallel to scene 5, and scene 2 seems to be parallel to scene 4. So just by noting the different scenes, we already get an idea that this chapter might have a chiastic structure. And once we take a closer look at the different scenes, we see that this is indeed the case. In both scenes 2 and 4, for example, Daniel talks with a man named Arioch about the decree to kill the wise men, and then goes into the king. And in both scenes 1 and 5, people appear before Nebuchadnezzar, who are supposed to interpret his dream for him. In scene 1, it's the wise men. In scene 5, it's Daniel. Now note that the connection between these two is already indicated by the wording in verses 10 and 27, because both Daniel and the wise men answer before the king and say. And these are the only times that this particular phrase occurs in this chapter. So once you look at it carefully, it's pretty obvious that there's a chiastic structure, which looks something like this. Do you see how beautifully this chapter has been written? It's a work of art. But as always in the Bible, the beauty is not an end in itself, but always a means of communication. So what does the structure communicate? Well, for one thing, it highlights the contrast between Daniel and the wise men. While they cannot interpret the dream, and as a result face execution, he can, and as a result is rewarded. Also, while the wise men claim that the gods are able to reveal the secret, Daniel states that the God of heaven is able to do this. So the structure also contrasts the gods and the God of heaven. Both are supposed to be able to reveal the secret, but only the God of heaven does. And where does this happen? At the very center of the central scene in verse 19. This divine revelation is the turning point of the chapter. Beforehand, there's uncertainty and fear. The king is angry. The wise men are afraid they're going to die. But then God reveals the secret, and everything turns out well. The dream is recounted and interpreted. The king is no longer troubled and angry. The wise men are spared. Daniel and his friends are promoted. Which means the structure shows the main point of this chapter is not just that God is in control of history and that in the end he will raise up his eternal kingdom, but that he's a God who reveals himself and his plans to human beings. He's not a distant God whose dwelling is not with men like the gods the wise men talk about in verse 11. Instead, he's a God who comes close, who's compassionate, who answers prayer, who wants us to know what his plans for the future are, who allows us to see the greater picture that puts our current situation in perspective. In other words, He's just the kind of God we need in difficult and uncertain times like these. So, is that all there is to say or discover about the structure of Daniel 2? Of course not. That's the great thing about the Bible. There's always more to discover. So if you've seen something here I haven't, or you just want to share something, ask a question, whatever, write it in the comments. As always, thanks so much for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time. Take care.